She was already dead. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. A woman left to freeze in a blizzard. A man who wanted nothing to do with her. One decision made in 3 seconds that neither of them could take back. What happened next in that mountain cabin would crack open two people who swore they were better off alone, and shake an entire frontier to its foundation. If you've ever been written off, left behind, or told you weren't worth saving, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like. Stay until the end. Let's go. The wind came down off the mountain like it meant to kill something. It wasn't the kind of wind that inconvenienced people or rattled loose shutters and moved on. This was the Iron Peak kind, the kind that the old-timers in the valley talked about in the same flat voice they used for avalanches and mine collapses. The kind that arrived without ceremony and left behind whatever it wanted to. Frozen livestock, split timber, men who had simply stopped in the wrong place at the wrong time and never started again. Thorn Maddox had lived on this mountain for 11 years. He knew that wind the same way he knew the weight of his own boots. Not by thinking about it, but by feel. And when it started picking up around midday on December 14th, he made a decision without overthinking it. Get down to Frost Junction, collect what he needed, and get back up the switchback trail before the sky fell in. He had maybe 4 hours, probably less. His sled dogs, 3 of them, a mismatched team named Brick, Soot, and a brindle female he'd never bothered naming, just called her son, pulled hard and steady through the upper trail. Thorn sat on the sled's runner, one boot dragging as a brake on the steeper sections, his face wrapped in a wool scarf that smelled like wood smoke and old grease. Snow came in sideways already. Not heavy yet, but with an edge to it. A warning. Frost Junction came into view around the last switchback, and the sight of it made something cold settle in Thorn's chest that had nothing to do with temperature. The place was dying. It hadn't always been this way. 10 years ago, Frost Junction had been a working settlement, 40, 50 souls at its peak, built up around the mining operation on the southern ridge and the rail line that came through twice a week. There had been a general store, a feed barn, a boarding house that also served as a saloon on Saturday nights. There had been children. Thorn had watched it all from a distance, the way he watched most human things, with a kind of detached, arm-length interest that never quite invited itself closer. But the Southern Ridge mine had played out, then partially collapsed. The rail company had rerouted. People followed the money the way people always did, and Frost Junction had gone from a settlement to a village to something smaller than a village. Maybe 8 permanent residents now, clinging to the place out of stubbornness or poverty, or both. Old Harlan Greer still ran the general store, though he kept fewer and fewer goods on the shelves each season. The Buford brothers trapped the lower runs. A widow named Sutter lived in the biggest house near the old depot and rented 2 of her rooms to nobody in particular. Thorn didn't socialize when he came down. He wasn't rude about it. He nodded to people, answered when asked a direct question, paid for his goods in coin without haggling. But he didn't linger. He didn't accept invitations to sit by someone's fire and talk about the weather or the price of pelts or whatever else people talked about when they gathered together in small rooms. He had learned, through a decade of deliberate practice, how to be in a place without quite being part of it. He tied the dogs to the hitching post outside Greer's store, checked the sky, darker than it should be, the clouds moving fast and low, and pushed through the door. Greer looked up from behind the counter. He was somewhere between 60 and ancient, with a face like dried leather and eyes that were still sharp and a little suspicious of everything, which Thorn had always privately respected. "Storm's coming in quick," Greer said by way of greeting. "I know it." Thorn pulled out his list, written on the back of a flour sack scrap, and set it on the counter. "What do you have?" They went through it. Salt, 3 pounds. Greer had it. Flour, 10 pounds. He had 8. Lamp oil, 2 tins. One available, the other on order that was now 2 weeks late and probably wasn't coming before spring. Thorn took the one. He added a paper of needles, a block of hard soap, and on an impulse he didn't particularly examine, a small tin of tobacco that he rarely smoked but kept around the way some men kept a bottle. For the nights that stretched long and the silence got a particular quality to it. He was loading the last of it into the sled bags when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of something, a shape that didn't belong in the corner of his vision. He stopped, looked, The old train depot sat at the far end of what had passed for Frost Junction's main street, a long, low building of dark timber with a platform extending along one side. Empty for 3 years now. The windows were boarded, the platform weathered gray, the tracks half buried in drifted snow that nobody bothered to clear anymore. Someone was lying against the far end of the platform. Thorne's first thought, the fast practical thought that came before anything else, was that one of the Buford brothers had gotten drunk and fallen asleep in exactly the wrong place. It had happened before, but even as he thought it, he knew the shape was wrong. Too small, the bundle too compact. Not the sprawl of a drunk man, but the curled-in stillness of something that had tried to make itself smaller and then run out of the ability to try. He crossed the street. The wind was really picking up now, throwing granular snow into his face, and he had to squint to see clearly as he stepped onto the depot platform. His boots were loud on the warped boards. It wasn't a Buford brother. It was a woman. She was curled on her side, knees pulled toward her chest in a way that might have been intentional once, conservation of heat, the body's animal logic, but wasn't intentional anymore. Her coat was wool, dark gray, and it was soaked through and refrozen so it sat on her like armor. A scarf had partially unwrapped from her face. What he could see of her skin was the wrong color, not the red of cold, not even the white of dangerous cold, but something between a grayish, waxy pallor that he had seen before on things that were no longer alive. But her chest moved, barely. But it moved. "Hey." He crouched, put a hand on her shoulder. "Hey." Nothing. He pulled the scarf back from her face. 30, maybe. Dark hair plastered wet against her forehead. There was a cut above her left eye. Dried blood tracked down the side of her face and frozen there. Her lips were cracked and bluish. Her eyelashes had frost on them. On the platform beside her, gripped in both hands even now, even unconscious, was a medical satchel. The clasp had broken and it had fallen open. He could see instruments inside, cloth bandages, small brown bottles, a doctor's bag, or close enough to it. Thorne rocked back on his heels and looked at the sky. The storm was maybe 2 hours out now, maybe less. The light had gone that particular flat gray that meant the real snow was coming, not the spitting advance guard he was already getting hit by. He looked back down the street. Greer's store, the widow Sutter's house. He could bring her inside somewhere, leave her with people, get himself up the mountain before the trail became impassable. That was the sensible thing. He looked at the woman again, the cut on her head, the way her hands were still locked around the medical bag, even unconscious, knuckles paler than pale. Wherever she had come from, whatever had happened to her, she hadn't ended up here by accident. She had been left here. He was certain of it, the same way he was certain of the storm coming. Not because he could prove it, but because he'd been on this mountain long enough to recognize when something had been deliberately discarded. The sensible thing pulled at him for about 3 more seconds. Then he straightened up, went back to the sled, and began rearranging the supply bags. He didn't bring her inside Greer's store. He thought about it, and then didn't. Greer was old and alone. The widow Sutter's house was warm, but Sutter was a woman in her 60s with a bad hip who couldn't lift much and would have real trouble managing someone this sick if things went sideways. And things could go sideways very fast with cold injury. He knew that from experience he didn't enjoy remembering. There was no doctor within 40 miles of Frost Junction, and in a blizzard, 40 miles was infinity. He had a cabin. He had a fireplace that could heat a room to baking if he fed it right. He knew more about treating cold injury than he'd ever wanted to know. He worked quickly. He got his hands under her coat. She was heavier than she looked, dense with wet wool and the dead weight of unconsciousness. And he lifted her as carefully as he could manage and carried her to the sled. The medical bag he tucked in beside her. He packed the remaining supplies around and over her for what small windbreak it would provide, untied the dogs, and looked at the sky one more time. He figured if he pushed the dogs hard, he had about 90 minutes before the storm closed the trail behind him. "Go," he told the dogs. They went. But the trail up to Thorne's cabin was not a trail in any conventional sense. It was more an understanding between him and the mountain. A series of decisions he had made over years about where to place his feet and where not to, which slopes were stable and which would betray you, where to follow the tree line and where to cut across open ground. He could have walked it blind, in the dark, In moderate snowfall, he had. What was coming wasn't moderate. He made it in 70 minutes, by his reckoning, and by the last quarter mile the wind was a physical thing pushing back against the dogs, and the snow was coming in so thick that he could barely see the tree line. The dogs knew the way better than they needed to see it. Brick, in particular, the lad dog, had a compass for this trail that Thorn had come to trust completely. They came up the final rise and through the tree break, and the cabin materialized out of the white like a dark thought, solid and real and almost beautiful for being what it was. He got the woman inside first. The cabin was cold. He'd banked the fire before he left, and it had died down to coals. He carried her to the bunk along the far wall, laid her down on the rough wool blanket, and went straight to the fireplace. Kindling, small logs. He didn't waste time or thought on it. His hands knew what to do. The fire caught, and he built it up fast, not gradually the way he normally would, until the fireplace was roaring with a heat that pushed back against the walls. Then he turned to look at her properly for the first time. In the cabin's dim light, he got a lantern going while the fire worked. She looked worse than she had on the depot platform. Her color was wrong all over. He pulled off his gloves and felt for her pulse at her throat. It was there. Slow and thin, but there. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Frostbite. Definitely her feet. Her boots, when he pulled at them, were frozen solid. He set them near the fire, but not close. He knew better than to apply direct heat to frozen tissue. It caused more damage than the cold. Her hands were bad too. The fingers had gone white and waxy. The cut on her head was old enough that the bleeding had stopped, but it needed cleaning. He had to get the wet clothes off her. He was not a man who made a production of things. He got the frozen coat off first. It took both hands and real effort. The wool had stiffened like board. He worked fast and matter-of-factly, the way he would have worked on an injured dog or a man he was trying to keep alive in the field. Underneath the coat, she was wearing a wool skirt, a practical thick-weave blouse, and what appeared to be 2 more layers beneath that, which told him she'd known something was coming and dressed accordingly. The layers had helped. Her core was cold, but not as catastrophically cold as her extremities. He got her into dry wool, his wool, a shirt 3 sizes too large and a spare pair of trousers that he had to fold up at the ankle, and then loaded her under every blanket he owned, which was 3. He put hot water in a cloth-wrapped jar and tucked it against her, not touching her skin directly. Then he sat on the stool beside the bunk and watched her breathe. The storm hit the cabin fully about 20 minutes after he'd gotten her inside. He could hear it, the wind against the log walls, the groan of the roof timbers, the particular silence underneath the noise that meant the world outside had been erased. Nowhere to go. Nobody coming. He fed the fire. She breathed. Oh, she came back in pieces. The first time she made a sound was somewhere in the middle of the night, a sharp involuntary catch of breath that brought Thorn out of the chair in the corner where he'd been dozing. He crossed to the bunk. Her eyes were moving under her lids. Her hands were clenching on the blanket. "Take it easy," he said, which was a thing he'd said to injured animals and made sense enough to say here. She made a sound that might have been a word and wasn't. Her feet were thawing. That was what was happening. He'd seen it before, and it was not pleasant. The return of circulation to severely cold tissue was brutally painful, more painful, some said, than the cold itself. There wasn't much he could do except keep the warming gradual and careful and hope the damage wasn't permanent. She slipped back under. He went back to the chair. The second time she surfaced, hours later, it was with more intention. Her eyes opened. Dark eyes, he noted, brown or very dark green, hard to tell in firelight, and they moved around the room with the careful, deliberate movement of a person who knows they've woken somewhere unexpected and is trying to determine the threat level before they do anything else. Thorn respected that instinct. He stayed where he was, in the chair, and let her look. "You're in a cabin," he said. "You're not dead. Try not to move your feet yet." Her eyes found him. They were sharper than he'd expected, given everything. "Where—" Her voice came out as a scrape. She tried again. "Where is this?" "Mountain, about 3 miles above Frost Junction. My place." A pause. She was processing. "I was at the depot," she said. "You were dying at the depot. There's a difference." Her jaw tightened slightly. He filed that away. She didn't like being told what her situation was. Noted. The bag, she said. My medical bag. Right there. He nodded to the corner where he'd set it. I didn't touch anything in it. Something in her face relaxed, just fractionally. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. He watched her take stock. Her expression shifted through things he didn't try to interpret, settling finally into something careful and contained. Who are you? She asked. Thorn Maddox. I trap the upper runs. I come down for supplies a couple times a winter. Thorn, she repeated, like she was recording it. And you're Eleanor Voss. She said it with a kind of flatness that suggested the name came with weight she was used to carrying. I'm a nurse. She stopped. I came up on the eastbound rail 4 days ago. 4 days. He thought about that. 4 days was a long time to have been out in this without adequate shelter, even in the depot's partial cover. Someone left you there, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. Her expression didn't flinch, which he noted. Yes, she said simply. He waited. She didn't elaborate. Your feet took cold damage, he said. I've been keeping the warming slow. Your hands are better. The layers you were wearing helped. He paused. There's also a cut on your head. Her hand moved toward her temple, then stopped when the movement pulled at something painful. I fell, she said. Then, with a slight edge, or was pushed. I'm not entirely certain which. Thorn looked at her steadily and said nothing to that. She held his gaze without blinking. Can you drink? He asked. Yes. He got up and heated water. He had a small amount of dried willow bark that he used for his own injuries when needed, ground it into the water and added a little salt and what honey he had left in a crock. Not medicine exactly, useful nonetheless. She tried to sit up to drink it and made a sound she clearly would have preferred not to make. He steadied the cup, let her drink at her own pace. She finished most of it. Thank you, she said, and the two words came out with a kind of austere dignity that felt like more than politeness, like she meant it precisely. Sleep, he said. I need to assess my feet. In the morning, when there's light. You're stable and there's nothing to be done about it tonight that I haven't already done. She looked like she had something to say about that. Then she looked at the fireplace, at the wall of snow visible through the single high window, at the lantern on the shelf, and something practical won out over whatever else was happening behind her eyes. In the morning, she agreed. She was worse the next day before she was better. Thorn had expected this. The infection set in fast. The cut on her head had been sitting open and dirty longer than was wise, and her feet, as the damage became fully apparent in daylight, were angrier than he'd hoped. Not the worst he'd seen, not black, not gangrenous, not beyond recovery, but blistered and swollen and inflamed in a way that made her breath hiss sharply when she pulled back the blanket to look at them. All right, she said, to herself more than to him. Her jaw was set hard. All right. She opened her medical bag with hands that weren't working right yet, the fingers still stiff and clumsy, and began taking inventory. He watched her go through it with the systematic calm of someone who had done this in hard conditions before. She named things out loud, quietly, under her breath. Not for him, just organizing. I need clean water, she said without looking up. Boiled. And cloth I can tear. He's clean cloth. I can manage that. And if you have any spirits, whiskey or similar, I'll need it for the wound on my head, not for drinking. She said the last part with a slight dryness. I have a bottle. Good. He boiled water. He found an old linen shirt that had gone too thin at the elbows to be worth wearing and brought it to her. He set the whiskey bottle on the shelf by the bunk. She cleaned and dressed the head wound herself, which involved some contortion and 2 moments where he could see from across the room that she was working through real pain. But she did it without asking for help and without making noise about it. She examined her own feet with the careful, impersonal efficiency of someone examining a patient they'd never met. She rewrapped them with clean cloth from her bag. The blistering is 2nd degree, she said. Painful, but survivable. I'd know in a few days if there's deeper damage. There's probably deeper damage to the smaller toes on the right foot, Thorn said. She looked up at him. You've seen this before. Once or twice? Did they? She hesitated in a way he was starting to recognize. She was someone who measured her words before letting them out. But the calculation wasn't deceptive, just careful. Did they recover full function? He thought about the trapper from the lower valley, 8 years ago. One did, one didn't, depended on a lot of factors I couldn't control. She absorbed this, looked back down at her feet, nodded, once, like she was filing the information and moving on. I'll need to stay off them, she said. The storm's going to keep you here regardless. How long? This time of year on this mountain, 3 days minimum, could be a week. Her expression did something complicated. Not panic, nothing like panic, but he could see the weight of it land on her. A week. In a stranger's cabin. Incapacitated. I'll stay out of your way, she said, and the words came out with a kind of precise pride that he understood immediately. She was establishing terms. She wasn't a burden if she was establishing terms. You're not in my way, he said. It was true and also the easiest thing to say, so he said it. The storm buried them for 5 days. 5 days was a long time to share a one-room cabin with someone you hadn't known existed a week before. Thorne managed the fire, managed the dogs, bringing them into the lean-to shelter he'd built against the east wall of the cabin, managed the small mechanical work of survival that a blizzard demanded, keeping the chimney clear, keeping the woodpile accessible, rationing water when the snow melt got ahead of his melting capacity. Eleanor managed herself. That was the only way he could put it. She was incapacitated, and she managed herself anyway. She would not be read to, would not be talked at, did not want entertainment. She had him bring her the medical bag, and she went through everything in it with a systematic thoroughness that kept her occupied for most of the first day. She reorganized. She made inventory in a small notebook she produced from somewhere in the bag. She re-rolled bandages that had gotten damp and held them near the fire on a makeshift frame she fashioned from 2 of his cooking utensils, which he returned to without comment. On the second day, she asked him if he had anything to read. He had 3 books, a surveying manual, a well-worn copy of Thoreau, and a medical reference book on common frontier injuries that he'd picked up for practical reasons years ago. He put all 3 on the end of the bunk without comment. She looked at them. Of course you have this, she said, picking up the medical reference. It's useful. Half of this is wrong, but she opened it anyway. She spent 2 hours going through it, making small notations in pencil in the margins. Corrections, he realized, when he glanced over. She was annotating his book. Do you want it back when you're done? He asked. It'll be more useful than it was, she said, without looking up. That was, he would reflect later, probably the first real conversation they had. On the 3rd day, the fever came. He didn't notice it until evening. She'd been quieter than usual, which, given her general quietness, was notable. When he brought her the evening meal, salt pork and hardtack softened in broth, he was not a man who cooked elaborately, and she had not complained. She ate less than she normally did. He set the back of his hand against her forehead without asking permission. She pulled her head back sharply. Don't. You're running a fever. I'm aware. Her voice had a rough edge to it that hadn't been there in the morning. It's the feet. Some inflammation is expected. You're hot enough that I could feel it from here, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then reluctantly, like she was making a concession that cost her. It may be higher than expected. In her bag she had quinine sulfate. Not ideal for this, but useful. And he mixed it according to her instructions, then watched her drink it because she was holding the cup slightly wrong, her hands less steady than they'd been that morning. If you get worse, he said, tell me. I'll manage. That wasn't a question, he said. Tell me if you get worse. I've handled worse than this and I can help. It's not... He stopped, looked for the right words, didn't find perfect ones. It doesn't cost anything to say so. She was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. I'm not used to asking, she said. It wasn't an apology, just a statement of fact. I figured. And you are? Used to asking? No, he said honestly, but I'm not the sick one. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly. She wasn't someone who smiles easily, he was learning, but something adjacent to it. Fair point, she said. The fever ran 3 days. It peaked on the 2nd. He sat up most of that night, keeping the fire steady, watching her breathe through the delirium he'd been afraid was coming. She talked in the fever, the way feverish people do. Fragments, half sentences, names he didn't know. She said call him several times with an urgency that was painful to hear. She said something about a roof falling in. She said clearly and with great force, as if winning an argument, he's 17 years old and his hand is crushed, and I am not walking away. And then subsided back into the murmuring beneath the surface. He didn't ask her about it when she came back. Some things weren't his business. He'd learned that early, lived alone long enough for it to calcify into instinct. A person's pain was their own unless they chose to share it, but he filed it away. All of it. Yeah. When the fever broke, on the morning of the storm's 4th day, she woke up looking wrung out and about 10 years older than she had before, and the first thing she said was, "Is there coffee?" "I have coffee." "Please." He made it. She drank it sitting up in the bunk, wrapped in 2 of the 3 blankets, hands around the cup, looking at the high window where the storm was finally slackening. The light coming through was gray and thick, but it was light, not the white nothing of full blizzard. "I said things," she said, "in the fever. People do. Things I didn't mean to say out loud." He looked at her steadily. "I don't listen to things people say in a fever. It's not a fair accounting." She seemed to be deciding whether to accept that. Then, "I meant what I said about the boy," she said carefully. "I know." A pause. The fire, the wind, lower now, losing its worst edge. "His name was Colum," she said. "Colum Barrett, 17 years old. He was working a secondary shaft in the Halverson mine. You may have heard of it, east of here, Copper Ridge operation. There was a support failure. His hand was badly damaged, crush injury, several bones. He needed surgery and real medical care, or he was going to lose the hand." She was looking at the window, not at him. "The mine foreman, a man named Galt, told me to treat him and get him back to work inside the week. That wasn't possible. Medically not possible. Colum needed rest and immobilization and probably bone setting that I couldn't do alone." She paused. "I told Galt that. I told him in front of the other workers. How did he take that?" "About as well as men like Galt usually take a woman contradicting them in front of an audience." She looked down at the coffee cup. "He told me my services were no longer needed at the site. He said a lot of other things too, but that was the relevant part. He arranged my transport out on the rail." Another pause. "The transport let me off at Frost Junction. Galt's man told me there would be a connecting line. There wasn't, and then the storm came." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "He left you to die," he said. "He left me stranded," she said. "Whether that qualified as leaving me to die is perhaps a question of intent versus outcome. Same thing in this country." She looked at him. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I suppose it is." Thorne set his own cup down. He was looking at the far wall where his trapping maps were pinned, the upper runs, the lower trails, the pass routes marked in pencil. He was thinking something through. "Halverson mine," he said. "Galt, Copper Ridge operation." "You know it?" "I know of it, know of Galt." He left it at that. She didn't push. He noticed that she didn't push even though she clearly wanted more. She was good at reading when to stop. They sat in the quiet for a while, both of them holding their cups, the storm finishing itself outside. "The boy," Thorne said. "Colum. What happened to him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. "I don't know," she said. "I got on the rail and then I was here. I haven't been able to—" She stopped. "I don't know." He looked at her then, looked at her properly. In the gray morning light coming through the high window, with the coffee steam between them and the fire going low and the storm finally dying outside. She was looking at the wall with an expression that she probably didn't know she was wearing. That particular flatness of a person who is very afraid of an answer they might receive and has decided to defer receiving it for as long as possible. "We'll find out," he said. "When the trail opens." She looked at him. "I have ways of getting information," he said, which was true. He knew the network of trappers and trading posts and seasonal travelers that functioned on this mountain as something like a telegraph. "Give me a few days." She studied him. He had the sense of being weighed with some precision. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not ungratefully. genuinely asking. Thorne considered the question. He was not a man who lied as a rule. It took too much maintenance. But he was also not a man who handed over more truth than was necessary. He thought about the depot platform, the medical bag clutched in both hands, the cut on her face and the way she'd been left, and the storm coming and the decision he'd made in 3 seconds. "You didn't deserve what happened to you," he said finally. "That's reason enough." Eleanor Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not softened, exactly. More like a door that had been triple-latched opened a single careful degree. "All right," she said. She went back to her coffee. He went back to his. Outside, the storm continued its slow surrender, and the mountain waited beneath it, patient and unmoved, for whatever came next. On the 5th morning, the snow stopped. The world outside the cabin window was white and absolute and utterly silent. The silence of a frontier that had just finished demonstrating what it was capable of, and was now simply waiting to see what the survivors would do. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had been strangers 1 week ago sat on opposite sides of a fire, and let that silence exist between them, neither of them feeling, for the first time in a long time, the particular weight of being alone with it. Neither of them mentioned that. Both of them noticed. The 5th morning came in quiet and blinding white. Thorne was already outside when the sun crested the eastern ridge. He'd been up since before first light, which was habit more than intention, the mountain having trained him years ago to start moving before the cold set its full weight in. He cleared the snow from the cabin door, checked the lean-to where the dogs had spent the storm in relative comfort, assessed the woodpile, and then stood for a moment in the stillness and looked at what the blizzard had left behind. The trail down to Frost Junction was gone. Not blocked. Gone. Buried under 4 feet of new snow with wind-packed drifts running considerably deeper in the cuts between the tree lines. He'd seen winters like this before. The upper trail would be impassable for at least 3 more days, probably 5, depending on whether the temperature held or dropped again at night. If it dropped, the surface would crust and maybe become navigable on snowshoes. If it stayed mild, the drifts would settle and shift unpredictably, which was more dangerous than deep snow. He went back inside. Eleanor was awake. She'd managed to push herself to a sitting position against the cabin wall, which was more than she'd been able to do 2 days ago without his help. The improvement was real, but it was also, he could tell from the set of her jaw and the slight sheen of effort on her face, costing her something to maintain. "Trail's out," he said, unwinding his scarf. "How long?" 5 days, maybe. If we're lucky. She absorbed this without visible reaction, which he was coming to understand was not the same as no reaction. Eleanor Voss had a face that revealed things in small increments, if you were paying attention. And he was, somewhat against his own preferences, paying attention. "Your feet," he said. "How are they this morning?" "Better than yesterday." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "The right foot is still—" She paused, selecting the word carefully. "Significant. The left is improving. The blistering on 3 toes of the right has gone deeper than I initially thought." "Can you put weight on it?" "Not yet." He crossed to the bunk and crouched to look, without asking her permission, which he could tell she didn't particularly appreciate. The rewrapping she'd done herself the previous evening was neat and tight. She'd done it by feel in the dim light, and it was still better than most he'd seen done in full daylight. The right foot, when he carefully pulled back enough cloth to look, was still angry-looking, the skin taut and shiny over the worst of it. "You're going to need to stay off this for at least another week," he said. "I'm aware of my own prognosis." "Just saying it out loud." "Well?" She pulled the blanket back over her feet. "Now you've said it." He stood. There was a moment where neither of them said anything, and the fire filled the space and the cabin felt, not for the first time, considerably smaller than its actual dimensions. "I'll make breakfast," he said. "I can help." "You can't stand up." "I can sit at the table and do things that don't require standing." He considered arguing this. Then he looked at her expression and decided it wasn't a fight worth having. He brought the table closer to the bunk. It scraped loud on the floorboards, and set the supplies where she could reach them. She shelled dried corn for the mash without comment, working steadily, hands still not entirely cooperative but managing. They ate in the careful silence of 2 people who haven't yet established the rules of sharing a space. It was Eleanor who broke it. not with anything weighty, but with a practical question that surprised him slightly. How long have you been on this mountain? 11 years? Alone that whole time? More or less. She was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, what did you do before? He looked at her across the small table. People didn't usually ask him that. The few people he interacted with in Frost Junction had long since stopped asking. And the people from before, the people who would have known the before, were either gone or far enough away that the question never came up. Other things, he said. She held his gaze. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She seemed to decide something and went back to eating. He had the sense that she was filing the non-answer alongside other things she'd filed, organizing him the same way she'd organized the medical bag. Cataloging. Not pushing, but not forgetting either. He found himself unexpectedly almost wanting to answer her properly. He didn't. But the almost was something he noticed. The day settled into a rhythm that was uncomfortable at first and then less so. Thorne had things to do that kept him moving. Firewood, the dogs, the slow maintenance of a cabin that had just been through a serious storm. There were roof timbers to check, a window seam that had let in wind and now needed repacking with moss and clay he kept for the purpose. He brought snow in to melt for water, a slow and repetitive process, and kept the fire at the right level, which required constant small adjustments he made without thinking. Eleanor, unable to move freely, remade what she could within reach. She organized her medical bag a second time, more thoroughly than the first, he noticed, which suggested the first time had been shock management, and this was the real accounting. She asked him for the annotated medical reference book and spent 2 hours with it, not reading so much as arguing with it silently. He could tell by the way her expression shifted when she found something she disagreed with. She asked for paper and wrote things. He didn't ask what. In a small, precise hand. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had reached a kind of equilibrium that wasn't exactly comfortable but wasn't hostile either. He brought her tea. She said thank you. He checked the window he'd resealed. She told him, without being asked, that the seal on the lower left corner was still letting in cold because she could feel it from the bunk. He checked it, found she was right, repacked it. Good eye, he said. I've been staring at that wall for 5 days, she said. I noticed things. What else have you noticed? She looked at him with an expression that was, for Eleanor Voss, fairly readable. She hadn't expected him to invite the list. The south-facing wall is better insulated than the north, she said. You built this yourself? Most of it. The north wall logs are a different species than the others. Replaced later? Storm brought a tree down on that side 7 years ago. The replacement wood is younger. It'll need attention in another few winters. The chinking is already starting to crack in the upper sections. She said this as simple observation, no criticism in it. Thorne looked at the north wall. He knew this already, had been meaning to address it, and hadn't yet for no particular reason other than that there was always something else pressing. Having it named out loud by someone who'd been in the cabin less than a week had an effect he couldn't quite categorize. Noted, he said. Also, she said, you have a mouse situation in the corner behind the supply shelf. I know about the mouse. There's more than one. I know. There's evidence of at least 4. He turned to look at her. She looked back at him, direct and unblinking. I'll set traps, he said. I'd appreciate that. There it was again. That fractional, almost smile. He turned back to what he was doing before she saw that he'd noticed. The thing about being alone for 11 years was that you stopped experiencing your own space as a space at all. It became an extension of yourself. The cabin walls were no different from skin. The fire's particular rhythm was no different from a heartbeat. Thorne had not been aware of the mouse problem as a problem because he'd been living with it so long it had become background. He had not been aware that the north wall's chinking was something that needed to be discussed with another person because there had been no other person to discuss it with. Eleanor Voss noticed things. She noticed them and stated them plainly and without apparent agenda, which was disorienting in a way he hadn't anticipated. He set the mouse traps after dinner. The second and third days folded into each other with the slow, enforced intimacy of people who have no choice about proximity. Arguments happen. Small ones, practical ones, but real. The first was about the fire. Thorne kept the cabin at a temperature that reflected 11 years of living alone in the mountains. Functional, not generous. He didn't feel cold easily anymore. The body adapts. Eleanor, who was injured and stationary and burning energy on healing, was cold consistently. She said so on the second day, not as a complaint but as a statement of medical fact. "You need the temperature higher," she said, "for recovery. Cold slows circulation, and that's exactly what I don't need in my feet right now. I'm burning wood at twice my normal rate already." "I know. I'm not criticizing your management." She said it with careful precision. "I'm telling you the physiological requirement." He looked at the wood pile through the lean-to access, calculated. He could make it work. The supply wasn't as tight as it could be if he'd been feeding the fire for 2 people from the start. He added 2 more logs without saying anything else about it. She said, "Thank you," with the same weighted simplicity she always used for those 2 words. The second argument was about Galt. It came up indirectly on the third day when he mentioned, matter-of-factly, while checking his trapline maps, that he'd done some work near the Copper Ridge operation 2 years back, guiding a survey team. "You spent time near the Halverson mine?" She said it sharply, which was fast for Eleanor. "Near enough. I know the terrain." "Then you know what it is." She wasn't asking. "I know it's a copper operation that runs hard and pays as little as it can get away with. Galt's been foreman there 4 years. Before him there was a man named Trent, who was worse." He set the map down. "It's not an unusual story up here. An unusual story." Her voice had taken on a flatness he hadn't heard from her before. Not angry exactly, but compressed, pressurized. A 17-year-old boy with 4 crushed bones in his hand, being told to get back to work in a week. His mother came to the site while I was there. She rode 6 hours on a mule to come see him. She brought food in a cloth because she thought, she'd been told, it was a minor injury. She stopped. I had to be the one to tell her what minor meant to Galt. Thorne was quiet. "I know it's not unusual," she said. "That's exactly the problem. What were you doing at the site to begin with?" Halverson's operation contracts a regional medical arrangement, 1 visit per month from a traveling nurse or physician to satisfy the territory's labor oversight requirements, which are minimal, but at least they exist on paper. She said the last with a bitterness that was brief and controlled. "I've been making that circuit for 2 years. Copper Ridge, 2 other mining operations, a logging camp above the North Fork, once a month. It's not enough. It has never been enough. But it's what there is." He looked at her across the cabin. She was looking at her hands, the hands that were still not quite back to what they'd been, the fingers that didn't close all the way yet without stiffness. "The boy," he said. "Call him." "Yes, if he's alive and if his hand is being managed even imperfectly, he has reasonable odds." He said it as straightforwardly as he could, because sugar-coating medical reality was something he didn't do and he sensed Eleanor wouldn't want from him anyway. The cold will have kept infection down. If someone set the bones at least partially, no one at that site has the training to set bones. Then he's healing crooked, which is painful but not fatal. He can work with a hand that healed wrong, if he has to. He paused. "I'll find out what I can. I told you that." She looked up at him. There it was again, that door opening a precise and measured degree. "You did," she said. He didn't sleep well that night. This was not because of Eleanor specifically, or not only. It was that having another person in the cabin changed the acoustics of the dark. He was aware of her breathing. He was aware of the small sounds she made when she shifted position, the careful, controlled hiss of breath when she moved the wrong way, and pain moved through her feet. She tried not to make these sounds. He could tell. Tried to be silent about the pain the way she seemed to try to be silent about most things that cost her. But the cabin was not large and the night was very quiet, and he heard them anyway and lay awake with them and didn't know exactly what to do about that. Nothing, probably. There was nothing to do. He knew that. He was still awake at 2 a.m. On the 4th day she walked. Not well, not far, but she got herself upright using the wall for support and took 4 steps to the table and sat down in the chair rather than on the bunk. He watched this without commenting on it. When she sat down in the chair, she was breathing hard, and her face had gone tight with the effort of it, but she was sitting in a chair like a person rather than lying in a bunk like a patient, and something in her expression when she settled into it was the first thing he'd seen from her that was close to relief. "Don't push it too fast," he said. "I know my own limits." You know your limits from before. Frostbite changes the calculation. She looked at him steadily. Are you always this cautionary? Are you always this stubborn? A beat. Yes, she said plainly. Comes with the work. You can't be the kind of person who backs down when someone tells you the boy will be fine by next week and keep doing this job. He thought about that. Fair enough. Are you? Always this cautionary? He considered. No, he said. Usually I don't have anything to be cautionary about. She seemed to take his meaning, that having someone else to worry about was, for him, a novel condition. She looked at the fire. I'm sorry, she said, for the imposition. You didn't impose. You nearly died on a train platform. Consequentially, the same thing from your perspective. It's not the same thing, he said, with more edge than he'd intended. He pulled it back. I'm not put out by you being here. That's not what I meant. She looked at him with the careful attention she gave everything. What did you mean? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, organizing. He was not a man who talked about what he meant as a general practice. He found the process inefficient and often inaccurate. By the time you'd found the words for something, the thing itself had shifted. You didn't create your situation, he said finally. Galt did. You just ended up in front of me because of it. He looked at the window. I'm not doing you any favor that basic decency doesn't require. Don't thank me for it like it was something more than that. The silence that followed this was different from the other silences they'd had. He couldn't have said exactly how. All right, she said after a while, but I'm going to thank you anyway. Eleanor, because it was more than basic decency, and we both know it. Her voice was even and quiet and completely certain. Basic decency would have been bringing me to Greer's store and leaving. You drove 3 miles up an icy mountain trail into a blizzard with an unconscious stranger on your sled. That's not basic decency, Thorne. That's something else. He had no answer to that. She seemed to know he didn't and let it alone. On the 5th day he heard news, or the closest thing to news the mountain allowed. Pete Olander came by, not by design, but because Pete Olander was one of 3 men who trapped the section between Thorne's Mountain and the Eastern Ridge. And Pete was stubborn about his line regardless of weather, a habit that Thorne respected and privately thought would kill him eventually. He knocked at the cabin door because the smoke from the chimney was too much for one man, and he was curious, and because Pete was the rare kind of person who let his curiosity move his feet. Pete was roughly 60, built like a stump, and had eyes that missed almost nothing. He took in Eleanor, sitting in the chair by the fire, medical bag in her lap, working on something with her hands. In one long look, and then turned those eyes to Thorne with a question in them that he answered by shaking his head slightly. None of your business. Pete, who understood this language, accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the 3-legged stool Thorne used as a footrest. Storm was mean, Pete said. Buried the trail solid. Won't open for another 3 days minimum. Maybe 4. Pete drank his coffee. Heard there was some trouble over at Copper Ridge before it hit. Halverson's man ran somebody out. Thorne's eyes went to Eleanor briefly. Pete followed the look. You'd be the somebody, Pete said to Eleanor, not unkindly. I would, she said. Pete nodded, slow. Boy with the busted hand. Call him something. Barrett, Eleanor said. She was very still. He's alive, Pete said. Word is he's been off his feet. The hand got infected apparently after you left. But the Buford boy's cousin works the ridge, and he said the boys passed the worst of it. Pete scratched his jaw. The other workers apparently were not happy about how things went. Gave Galt some significant trouble. He said this last part with a satisfaction he didn't try to hide. Eleanor breathed out. It was a small sound, barely audible, but Thorne heard it and saw the slight drop in her shoulders. A fraction of weight released that she'd been carrying for days without letting him see the full extent of it. Thank you, she said to Pete, with a steadiness that was clearly costing her. Didn't do anything, Pete said. You said what I needed to hear. Pete looked at her for a moment with the evaluating squint he normally reserved for weather patterns and problematic terrain. Then he looked at Thorne. Then he looked at his coffee cup. Good coffee, he said. After Pete left, Eleanor sat for a long time without speaking. Thorne went about the afternoon's work, trap maintenance, sharpening a blade that had gone dull, small repairs, and let her have the silence. It was almost dark when she said, "Galt is going to do this again." "Probably," he said, without turning from what he was working on. "To someone else. Another boy, or a woman, or whoever stands between him and what he considers efficient operation." Her voice was flat. "He won't stop because it cost him a nurse. It cost him nothing. It'll keep happening." "Yes, that's—" She stopped. "Unacceptable," he offered. "I was going to say inevitable, but unacceptable is the correct word." A pause. "I've been thinking about Copper Ridge, about the settlement up there. Not the mine site, but the workers' settlement, what there is of it. 40 or 50 men with families near the Eastern Cut. They have nothing. No medical care except the once-a-month arrangement that Galt can revoke any time he wants, because it runs through the mining company's contract." Thorne set down the blade and turned to look at her. She was looking at the fire, that particular focused expression she got when she was working something through. "A permanent clinic," she said quietly, "not attached to the mine. Independent. Something that operates regardless of what Galt or Halverson wants or doesn't want. That's a large idea for someone who can't walk to the table without support yet." "I'm aware of the irony." She looked at him then. "But I'm not wrong about the need." He held her gaze. Outside, the temperature was dropping. He could feel it through the walls, the particular tightening that meant a cold night was settling in over the snow. The dogs shifted in the lean-to. The fire needed a log. He put the log on. "No," he said. "You're not wrong about the need." She seemed to be deciding whether to say the next thing. He waited. "I'll need help," she said, "to make it work up here. The terrain, the access, I don't know this mountain the way you do." She said it carefully, looking at him with that precise, measuring steadiness. "I'm not asking you for anything. She stopped again. "You're telling me what you're thinking," he said. "Yes." "All right." He went back to the blade. "I'm listening." The cabin settled around them. The fire burned. The cold pressed at the walls and didn't get through. And Eleanor Voss, who had nearly died on a train platform and spent a week fighting her way back from it in a stranger's cabin on an Iron Peak mountain, began, slowly and carefully, to talk about what she was thinking. Thorne Maddox, who had lived alone for 11 years and gotten very good at it, listened. Really listened. The kind he'd almost forgotten he knew how to do. Not waiting for his turn to speak, not planning his response, just taking in what she was saying and letting it sit next to everything else he knew about this mountain and this country, and what it did to people who tried to survive it without anyone watching their back. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Outside, the temperature bottomed out, and the snow crusted over and the trail that would eventually take Eleanor Voss back down. The mountain waited, patient and frozen, for the thaw that was still days away. Inside the cabin, two people who had been strangers 1 week ago sat with a fire between them and found that the silence, when it came back, had changed its quality entirely. It was no longer the silence of two people tolerating proximity. It was the silence of two people thinking about the same thing. Neither of them mentioned that either, but both of them knew. The trail opened on the 9th day. Not fully. Nothing on Iron Peak opened fully in December. But enough. The temperature had dropped hard 2 nights running and put a crust on the snow that would hold weight if you were careful about it. Thorne went out at first light and walked the first quarter-mile of the switchback in snowshoes, testing the surface, reading the drifts. Manageable. Not easy, but manageable, which on this mountain amounted to the same thing as an invitation. He came back inside and said, "Trail's passable," and watched Eleanor's face. She was at the table. She'd been making it to the table on her own for 3 days now, a journey of 8 steps that she treated with the same grim focus she gave everything physical. She looked up from the notebook she was writing in. Something moved across her expression that she controlled before it fully arrived. "Good," she said. Just the one word. He didn't push on it. The truth was that Eleanor could not have made it down the trail yet. Her left foot had improved considerably. Weight-bearing, painful, but functional. Her right was a different story. The deeper damage he'd suspected in the smaller toes had declared itself over the past week. 2 toes on the outside of the right foot had lost sensation that hadn't come back, and when she walked with a compensation that she tried to conceal and didn't entirely succeed at. Getting down a steep, icy switchback in snowshoes was not something she could do. Not yet. Maybe not for another week. She knew this. He knew this. They didn't discuss it directly because discussing it directly would have required Eleanor to acknowledge a limitation she was still in the process of accepting. And Thorne had learned, what was still learning, that Eleanor Voss accepted limitations on her own schedule and not anyone else's. So the trail was passable, and she said good, and they both understood that it didn't change anything yet, and they moved on. What changed in those days after the storm released its grip on the mountain was subtler and harder to name. The enforced closeness of the blizzard had been survival. No room for anything else, no energy for anything beyond the immediate and necessary. But now the immediate emergency had passed, and they were still there, in the same cabin, and the space between them had to be renegotiated without a storm doing the negotiating for them. Thorne went back to his routines. He was up before light. He tended the dogs, checked his trap lines when the terrain allowed, processed what the traps yielded. 2 red fox in the first week, a marten, a beaver from the creek below the north tree line. He cured the pelts in the lean-to with the methodical patience that 11 years of solitary work had built into his hands. He cooked, simply and without much creativity, the same things he always cooked: salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal in various configurations, the occasional fresh meat when a trap delivered it. Eleanor ate what he made without complaint, which he'd come to appreciate. She didn't comment on the food's limitations, didn't ask for anything different, didn't make the small dissatisfied sounds that he imagined, based on no real evidence, that a person unused to frontier living might make. She ate like someone who understood that food was fuel and that making it difficult was a waste of everyone's time. On the 3rd day after the storm cleared, she said, "Can I help with supper?" He looked at her. She was standing at the table, steadying herself with one hand on the edge, her weight distributed carefully toward the left. "You can sit and do prep," he said. "Anything that doesn't require standing." "I can stand?" "You can stand for short periods, and then you need to sit." Her jaw went tight. "Thorne, I'm not arguing about this. Sit." She sat. But she did it with a particular quality of sitting that communicated very clearly that she was choosing to sit and not being made to. He brought her the dried beans to sort and the onion to cut. She sorted and cut with quick, practiced efficiency. And after a few minutes, the tight set of her shoulders eased because her hands were doing something useful, and that was what Eleanor needed, to be doing something useful. He'd figured that out about her in the first few days, filed it away, and worked around it wherever he could. "Tell me about the eastern settlement," she said while she cut. "The one near Copper Ridge. You've been there?" "Once or twice. It's not really a settlement, more a collection of structures that grew up where the mine workers' families landed. Maybe 40 people, some permanent buildings, mostly temporary." "Is there a structure that could serve as a clinic or space to build one?" He considered this while he added wood to the fire. "There's an old assay building that the mine abandoned when they moved the operation north 2 years ago. It's on the edge of the settlement, not on mine land. I'd have to look at it to tell you the condition." "Could we look at it?" He turned to look at her. She was cutting the onion with the focused precision she brought to everything, not looking up. "When the trail is fully clear and you can walk it," he said. "That could be weeks." "Yes?" She was quiet for a moment. "I have a window, Thorne. If I'm going to do this, I need to establish something before the territory's spring labor inspectors come through. That's when there's leverage, when Halverson needs to show compliance. If I can demonstrate an independent medical operation already in place, it changes what they can demand of him." He sat down across from her. "How much do you know about how Halverson operates?" "Enough. He's not going to like an independent clinic. An operation he can't control, serving his workers, making them less dependent on the mine's arrangements." "No," she agreed. "He won't like it at all." She said this with a calm that was not naivety. She knew exactly what she was saying. "That's somewhat the point." Thorne looked at her across the table. The late afternoon light came through the high window at a low angle and caught the side of her face, the still visible line of the healed cut above her eye. She was not beautiful in any soft or convenient sense. She had a face built for usefulness, strong bones, a directness in her eyes that left very little room for comfortable misunderstanding. She looked like someone who had been told difficult things for long enough that her face had rearranged itself to receive them without flinching. He had known, without ever consciously deciding to know it, that she was going to do this thing whether he helped or not. She'd been planning it since the fever broke, probably before the fever broke. "All right," he said. She looked up from the onions. "All right, what?" "When the trail's clear enough, I'll take you to look at the assay building." She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw in her expression the thing he was coming to recognize. The brief, visible acknowledgement of something that mattered, before she put it away and moved on. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me for things." "I'll stop when you stop doing things worth thanking you for." He had no answer to that either. He seemed to be running out of answers to Eleanor at a rate that should have concerned him more than it did. The walking started in earnest on the 11th day. Not outside. The terrain was still too unpredictable for that. And her right foot, while improving, was not ready for uneven frozen ground. But inside the cabin, Eleanor set herself a course. From the bunk to the door to the table to the window back to the bunk. 20 steps in a circuit. She walked it in the mornings after breakfast, slow and deliberate, one hand near the wall but not touching it unless she had to. Thorne watched the first time. After that, he didn't watch, not directly. He went about his morning work and was simply aware of her moving behind him, the measured pace, the sound of her breathing that told him how much it was costing her. It cost her a lot. The right foot, when she put full weight on it, sent pain through her face that she didn't make noise about, but that he could read in the tightening around her eyes, the controlled exhale, the brief pause before the next step. She did it anyway. Every morning, the same circuit. Then she'd sit, get her breathing back, and do it again. On the 4th morning of this, she was on her 3rd circuit, and he was at the window checking the weather when he heard her stop. He turned. She had her hand flat against the wall, not bracing, just resting there. Her eyes were closed. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen from her before. Not controlled, not careful, just stripped down to the effort itself, all the management she usually kept over her expression absent for a moment. He crossed the cabin. "Enough for today," he said. "One more. Eleanor." He said it flat, not unkindly. "Enough." She opened her eyes and looked at him. They were standing close, closer than they usually stood, the cabin not affording much choice. He could see the effort in her face, the stubborn set of her jaw working against the exhaustion underneath it. "I can't fall behind on this," she said. Her voice was lower than usual. "If the tissue doesn't get circulation restored through regular use, it won't heal correctly. I know the physiology. I have to keep pushing. I know, and you've pushed, and now you stop or you push too far and you're back to square one." He looked at her steadily. "I'll walk with you this afternoon. Slower pace, more time between circuits. You'll get the same benefit without burning through what you've got left." She looked at him for a long moment. This close, he was aware of things he normally kept in peripheral vision. The lines of tiredness around her eyes, the slight unevenness in her breathing, the way she was leaning just slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the wall. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." Another moment. Then she nodded, once, and let him guide her back to the chair. She sat down and didn't say anything else about it. He walked the circuit with her that afternoon, and the next morning, and the one after that. They didn't talk much during it. He matched his pace to hers and stayed close enough that if she needed to catch herself, she could, and far enough that she didn't have to think about it consciously. After a few days, she stopped thinking about him being there at all, which he understood was the correct outcome. She needed to be able to focus on the walking, not on being accompanied. The evenings changed. He couldn't have marked the exact moment, but somewhere in the 2nd week after the storm, the evenings in the cabin stopped being two people tolerating each other's presence and started being something else. Not dramatic about it, not announced, just different. It started with the maps. He had his trapping maps pinned to the east wall, hand-drawn, updated over years, the upper runs marked in red pencil and the lower trails in black, access points noted in a shorthand that only made sense to him. Eleanor asked him about them one evening, pointing to a section near the eastern ridge. "Is this the Copper Ridge area?" "Adjacent. The settlement would be here." He crossed to the map and indicated the spot. She got up, carefully, with the measured deliberateness she brought to all movement now, and came to stand beside him. She studied the map with genuine attention. "What's this mark here?" She pointed to a notation in his shorthand. Unstable slope. I marked it after an acquaintance came through that section in a wet spring and had trouble. And this? Creek crossing. Manageable in summer, dangerous in snowmelt season. She traced the route from his cabin to the eastern settlement with one finger, not touching the paper, hovering just above it. He watched her map it in her mind, the way he'd watched her do everything, thoroughly, systematically, storing it. It's not as far as I thought, she said. 4 miles on the main trail, less through the upper cut, but the upper cut isn't worth it except in summer. 4 miles is manageable. In good conditions with 2 functional feet, yes. She gave him a sideways look. You make a lot of footnotes to other people's statements. Someone has to. I make footnotes too. I just make them internally. I know, he said. I can tell. She looked at him with a slight surprise that she covered quickly. He went back to his chair. After that, the evenings often included the maps. She would ask questions, not naively, not from ignorance of the terrain, but from a specific kind of practical curiosity that he recognized because he'd had it himself when he first came to the mountain. She wanted to understand the place the way it actually was, not the way it looked on a surveyor's drawing. He answered her questions and sometimes asked his own, about the medical arrangements in the territory, about what an independent clinic actually required to operate, about the labor oversight structure she'd mentioned and how it worked in practice. He learned things he hadn't known he wanted to know. She learned the mountain in the evenings and walked it a little further each day, and somewhere in all of this, without either of them doing anything so deliberate as deciding, they began to talk through supper instead of beside it. It was the conversations that changed things. Or maybe it was that the conversations revealed the change that had already happened. He was never entirely sure which way the causation ran. She told him about how she'd come to nursing, which was not the path he might have guessed. She'd grown up in a mid-sized city, the second of 4 children, and she'd trained under a woman named Dr. Harriet Morse, who had run an unofficial clinic for immigrant families out of a converted warehouse near the rail yards for 15 years before the city shut it down on a building ordinance technicality that everyone understood was not actually about the building. What happened to her? Thorne asked. Morse. She moved the operation 3 times. Each time they found a reason to close it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She's still doing it. Smaller now, but still doing it. You wanted to do what she did. I wanted to be useful in the way she was useful. She didn't care about... She searched for the word. She didn't care about the arrangements, the official arrangements, who was supposed to serve which population, what the licensing required. She cared about who was in front of her and what they needed. That got her shut down repeatedly. Yes. Eleanor looked at the fire. It's the correct way to operate, and it gets you shut down repeatedly. I've made my peace with that. He looked at her. Have you? She met his eyes. After a moment, no, not entirely, but I've decided to do it anyway. He nodded slowly. He understood that. The decision to do the thing you haven't fully made peace with, because not doing it is worse. He'd made that kind of decision before, in a different life for different reasons, and the texture of it was recognizable. She asked him, that same evening, about before. The before he'd deflected the first time she asked. You don't have to tell me, she said. It was a statement, not a softening. She wasn't inviting him to confide. She was simply acknowledging that the information was his to keep if he wanted it. He looked at the fire for a while. I was a surveyor, he said. Territory mapping mostly. Federal contracts. I traveled a lot. Different ranges, different territories, sometimes years in one region before moving on. He paused. I was good at it. I liked the work. What changed? He was quiet. The fire moved. A man I worked with, he said finally. A partner, more than a colleague. We'd been running survey together for 4 years. He stopped. This was the part he didn't talk about, the part he'd worked very hard for 11 years to keep in the box it belonged in. There was an accident, a bad winter, bad terrain, decisions that were made in the wrong order. He didn't come out of it. He said this flatly, the way you say things that are too large for inflection. Eleanor was very still across the table. After that, Thorne said, I couldn't do the work the same way. Couldn't be responsible for another person in the field. So He made a gesture that encompassed the cabin, the mountain, the 11 years. I came here, started trapping, stopped taking on partners. You punished yourself, she said. He looked at her. I'm not judging you, she said, with the precision she always used. I'm naming what I see. You decided you weren't safe to be around, so you removed yourself. A pause. I understand that impulse. I've had versions of it. He looked at her for a moment. When? When Colin Barrett was sitting in that mine office with 4 broken bones, and I walked in and said exactly the wrong thing to Galt's face in front of 20 workers and made Galt angry enough that he... She stopped. I knew when I said it what the probable outcome was. I said it anyway, and then I spent a week on a frozen depot platform thinking about what it means to make decisions that put other people at risk. The boy was already at risk. You didn't put him there. No. But my decision about how to handle Galt may have made his situation worse in the short term. If I'd been more careful, more diplomatic, I might have stayed on the site longer and given him more time before... She cut herself off. It doesn't matter. The point is that I know what it is to doubt whether you're doing more harm than good. And I decided the answer wasn't to stop. It was to get better at the judgment. She held his gaze. Maybe it's different for you. Maybe, he said. They sat with it for a while. The fire burned low and he put another log on, and when he sat back down, the silence had the quality it sometimes had now. Not empty, but inhabited. The difference between a room that has no one in it and a room where 2 people are thinking separately about the same thing. Thorne, she said eventually. The accident. Whatever happened. It wasn't only your fault, was it? It wasn't quite a question. He didn't answer it as one. No, he said, after a long moment. It wasn't only my fault. But you took all of it. He looked at the wall. Someone had to. Eleanor looked at him across the fire with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not pity, nothing like pity, but something that had weight to it. Something that acknowledged without softening. That's a heavy thing to carry for 11 years, she said. You get used to it. Do you? He didn't answer that. She didn't push. They moved through the rest of December in the strange, suspended intimacy of 2 people cut off from the world by geography and season, thrown together by accident, and kept together by circumstance, and, increasingly, by something that neither of them named, because naming it would have required an acknowledgement that neither of them was ready for. He noticed things he'd stopped noticing about other people or had never noticed to begin with. The way she drank her morning coffee with both hands around the cup, even when her hands were fine, as though the warmth was the point. The way she laughed, rarely, but when it happened it was real, a short, surprised sound that she seemed mildly embarrassed by, as though she hadn't meant to let it out. The way she fell asleep in the chair some evenings while she was reading, head tilted to one side, the severe set of her face entirely gone in sleep, and woke up irritated at herself for having done it. She noticed things about him too. He knew this because she acted on them without announcing them. Started leaving the annotated medical reference where he could reach it after she'd noticed him reading it in the evenings. Started making the morning coffee herself on the days she could manage it before he was up, because she'd noticed he preferred it stronger than he made it when he thought he was only making it for himself. Started on cold nights when the fire needed banking, leaving a small supply of kindling near the chair he favored rather than in its usual place by the fireplace. Small things, entirely practical. They both understood them as practical. On the last day of December, Eleanor walked outside for the first time. He didn't help her. She hadn't asked, and he'd learned not to offer when she was working up to something. He heard her at the door, the particular sequence of sounds that meant she was putting on the coat he'd found for her in the storage chest. Too large, men's wool, but solid, and the boots that he'd packed with extra cloth to accommodate the wrapping on her right foot. He stayed where he was and listened to the door open and close. She was outside for 12 minutes. He knew because he was aware of every one of them. Not worried, exactly, but present in the way he was present with anything that required his attention. When she came back in, her face was red from the cold and her eyes had a brightness to them that was different from the brightness of the cabin firelight. She sat down and pulled off the boot carefully, checked the foot, rewrapped one of the toes that had shifted. He watched her. "Well?" he said. "Well." She looked at him. "The world is still there. It generally is." "The south-facing slope looks manageable," she said. Another week and I could probably make it to the lower tree line and back. Probably, he agreed. She put the boot back on, looked at the window. Outside, the last day of 1887 was blue and cold, and entirely indifferent to the fact that it was the last of anything, and the mountain stood over all of it the way it always had, patient and enormous, and neither cruel nor kind. "Happy New Year," Thorne said. It was the first time in 11 years he had said that to anyone. Eleanor looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. "Happy New Year," she said. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the tree line and snow fell from the upper branches in small sudden cascades. Not a storm, just the mountain settling, the way it always did, into whatever came next. January came in hard and stayed that way. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the first week of the new year and held there, the kind of cold that didn't move or fluctuate or give you a mild afternoon to recover in. It just sat on the mountain like a fact, and you managed around it or you didn't manage. Thorne had been through enough Iron Peak winters to know this particular quality of cold, the way it made the air brittle and the snowpack dense and the days short in a way that felt personal. He adjusted his routines, shorter runs on the trap line, more time managing the woodpile, earlier fires in the evening. Eleanor walked every day. She'd moved her circuit outside by the second week of January, which was earlier than he thought prudent and exactly when he'd known she would do it. She started with the flat area immediately in front of the cabin, back and forth 20 passes, boots crunching on the packed surface, and then extended it day by day to the tree line and back, then to the first switchback turn and back, then down the beginning of the trail proper, picking her way carefully over the icy sections with a walking staff Thorne had cut from a deadfall ash and left leaning against the cabin door without comment. She used the staff without comment. He noted that and didn't say anything about it. The right foot had settled into what she called, with clinical plainness, a partial recovery. The sensation in the two outer toes was probably not coming back. She'd told him this one evening with a matter-of-factness that he suspected cost her more than she let on. She could walk on the foot, could manage uneven terrain with care, could do most of what she'd been able to do before. She would always feel the cold in it faster than normal. She would always have to manage it with extra care in winter. "People work with worse," she said when she told him. "They do," he agreed. "Don't make it into something." "I wasn't going to." She looked at him like she was checking, then nodded. He did make it into something privately. He thought about it more than was useful. The two toes that wouldn't come back, the depot platform, the 3 seconds of decision-making that had changed the degree of damage from what it was to what it could have been if he'd taken her to Greer's store instead. He didn't say any of this to Eleanor. She would have told him correctly that the accounting was pointless, but he kept the ledger in his head anyway, the way people do with things they can't change and can't entirely let go. The first real argument happened on a Tuesday in mid-January. It started practically, as their arguments always did. They were never the kind of people who fought about what they were actually fighting about, at least not at first. It started with a disagreement about the route to the eastern settlement. He was showing her the trail on the wall map, the 4-mile route along the main switchback that dropped to the lower valley and came up the other side to Copper Ridge. It was the safe route, longer but manageable in winter if the weather held. "What about this?" She pointed to the upper cut he'd mentioned weeks ago, a diagonal route across the eastern face that shaved 1.5 miles off the distance but required crossing an exposed ridge section. "In January, no. You said it's unusable in winter, but you've used it in winter." He looked at her. "Pete Olander told you that." "Pete talks. You don't." She said this without reproach. "He mentioned you came through the upper cut last February to reach a trapper who'd been injured." "Different circumstances." "How?" "He was alone and dying, and I was the only one who could get there in time. And if someone in the eastern settlement needs help in the same kind of emergency, am I supposed to take 4 miles of switchback while they—" "You're not going to be able to use the upper cut in winter," he said, and his voice came out with more edge than he'd intended. "Not with your foot as it is. Not yet." The silence that followed this had a different texture than their usual silences. She was looking at the map, not at him. He could see the line of her jaw. "You don't get to make that decision," she said. Her voice was even. That was worse than if she'd snapped at him. "I'm telling you what the terrain requires. You're telling me what I can and can't manage based on an assessment of my limitations that I didn't ask you to make." She looked at him then. Her eyes were direct and not particularly warm. I know my foot, Thorn. I know it better than you do. I know what I can manage and what I can't, and I appreciate that you have knowledge of this mountain that I don't. But you don't get to bundle those two things together and use the terrain as cover for deciding what I'm capable of. He stared at her. The fire was loud for a moment. I'm not... He stopped. Thought about it honestly. I'm not doing that deliberately. I know you're not. She turned back to the map. Her voice had lost some of its edge. I know you're not. But you're doing it. He thought about what she'd said. Really thought about it, not defensively. She was right. He'd taken two separate things. His knowledge of the upper cut in winter conditions, which was real and relevant, and his assessment of her physical capability, which was also real but was hers to make, not his. And he'd wrapped them together into a statement that came out sounding like he was making her decision for her. He'd done it without noticing, which was probably the more honest problem. The upper cut, he said. In winter, the exposure on the eastern face runs about 300 yards where there's no windbreak. In high wind, that section is dangerous regardless of who's crossing it. That's the terrain issue. She looked at him, reading the shift. In low wind? She asked. Manageable, if you know where to step. Can you show me where to step? A pause. Yes, he said. She nodded. Then we go through the upper cut when conditions allow it, and take the main trail when they don't, and I make the call on my foot. And I make the call on the wind, he said. Something settled between them. Not a peace treaty. More like a revised map of the territory, new boundaries drawn where the old ones had been wrong. Fine, she said. Fine, he said. They went back to planning. The planning itself had become a significant occupation of the January evenings. Eleanor's vision for the Eastern Settlement Clinic had grown more detailed and considerably more complicated in the weeks since she'd first outlined it to him, accumulating the way practical plans do when someone with a systematic mind has long hours and enforced stillness to develop them. She had filled most of her small notebook and asked him for paper, which he supplied. She had lists, equipment needed, materials for the assay building conversion, medical supplies, what she could carry on the trail, and what would need to come by sled. She had a timeline, optimistic, he thought, but not absurdly so. She had thought about how to establish independence from the mine's oversight, and had written a 3-page argument for why the territory's labor statutes would protect an independent medical operation from interference by Halverson. He'd read it. It was a good argument. He'd told her so, and she'd looked mildly surprised, then written a small revision in the margin that made it better. The thing he hadn't expected and still didn't entirely know what to do with was how much he was contributing to the planning. He told himself it was practical. He knew the terrain, knew the settlement, knew the people in ways that she didn't yet. That was useful information, and there was no reason to withhold it. But it was more than information. He was thinking about the problems she identified and coming to dinner with thoughts about them. He was sketching, on the back of a flour sack, a rough layout of what he remembered of the assay building interior and what changes would make it functional as a clinic. He was, without ever deciding to be, invested in this. He noticed this about himself and put it to one side, the same place he was putting several other things he'd noticed about himself lately, in a pile that he was aware of and not ready to sort through. It was Pete Olander who forced the conversation that changed everything. Pete came through again in late January, said he had, Thorn was realizing, started coming through more regularly than his trapline strictly required, which meant he was curious and not above manufacturing reasons to be curious. He arrived on a Tuesday with a haunch of venison that he claimed was surplus from a lucky shot the previous day, which was possibly true and possibly not. They ate together, the three of them, which was a thing that had never happened in Thorn's cabin before in 11 years. Pete talked more than either of them, which was fine. Pete was someone who talked the way other people breathed, as a continuous baseline function rather than a deliberate choice. He talked about the lower valley, about the family that had moved into the old Brannock homestead in November, about the state of the trail over the North Pass. Then he said in the same casual tone, "Word coming out of Copper Ridge is that Galt's been asking questions about you." He said this to Eleanor, not to Thorn. Specifically, about where you went after the depot. Eleanor set down her fork. Thorn looked at Pete. "What kind of questions?" Thorn said. The kind where he's trying to find out if she's gone for good or if she's going to be a problem. Pete was matter-of-fact about it. He's got interests in keeping the Halverson operation running without complications. A nurse who got left to die on his order, who's still alive and knows the territory, that's a complication. I was left stranded, Eleanor said. The intent is what it is, Thorne said. He was looking at Pete. Who's he asking? Railmen, mostly. The Frost Junction regulars. Pete picked up his coffee. Nobody's told him anything useful, partly because nobody knows anything useful, and partly because Galt isn't particularly well liked. He looked at Eleanor. But he knows you're somewhere on the mountain. It's not a big mountain in terms of who lives on it permanently. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Thorne watched her process this. The careful stillness, the internal accounting. It changes the timeline, she said. To him, not to Pete. If Galt is actively looking, I need to establish the clinic before he can build a legal argument against it. Once it's operating, once the settlement families are depending on it, it's much harder to remove. Or, Thorne said with the directness he generally preferred, it becomes a thing he wants to remove more urgently. Yes, she said, both things are true. Pete looked between them with the mild, interested expression of a man watching a chess game he hadn't been invited to play. You're building a clinic, he said to Eleanor. I'm planning to. In the Eastern Settlement. Yes. Pete drank his coffee, nodded slowly. My cousin Abe Olander runs a supply team between Frost Junction and the Northern Logging Camp. Goes through the Eastern Settlement twice a month. He set the cup down. He owes me several favors. I could probably arrange for him to carry medical supplies at no charge as part of his regular route. Eleanor looked at him. Why would you do that? Pete shrugged, a gesture that encompassed a complicated philosophy in one movement. My wife died in childbirth 12 years ago, he said, in a settlement 60 miles north of here. No medical person within 3 days' ride. Different mountain, same story. He stood up, picked his hat off the table. I don't need a reason beyond that. After he left, the cabin was quiet in the particular way it got when something important had just happened, and neither of them was ready to name it yet. He means it, Thorne said. I know. Eleanor was looking at the door Pete had closed behind him. People keep... She stopped. Keep what? Showing up. She said it with a kind of quiet surprise that she didn't try to conceal. I had this idea that this was going to be difficult in a very solitary way, that I was going to have to build everything from nothing against resistance, alone. You haven't been doing it alone for a while now, he said. She looked at him. The fire was between them, and the light was the amber kind that made the cabin feel smaller, warmer, closer than it was. She held his gaze for a moment, a long moment, longer than their usual direct exchanges. No, she said, I haven't. He looked away first, got up to put the last log on the fire. He stood with his back to her for a moment, watching the flames take. February, he said. If the weather holds, we can get to the Eastern Settlement in February. I want to see the assay building before you commit to it. You want to see the building, she repeated. Not a question, testing the words for what was underneath them. The structural integrity matters. If it's too far gone, there's another option. There's an empty homestead on the south edge of the settlement. Family moved on 3 years ago. Different layout but sounder walls. Thorne. He turned. Thank you, she said, for not telling me you're doing this because it's practical. He looked at her steadily. It is practical. I know. She didn't look away. It's also something else. The thing he'd been putting in the pile, saving for later. It moved. He felt it move, the way you feel the ground settle under snow. Not dramatic, not sudden, just present and impossible to unfeel. Get some sleep, he said. Your foot needs rest. She let it go. She was good at letting things go on his schedule when she'd already made her point. He'd noticed that about her too. He sat up late that night, the fire going low, the dogs quiet in the lean-to, the mountain dark and cold and enormous outside the walls. He thought about the pile he'd been building. He looked at it more honestly than he had before, because Pete Olander's face across the supper table had done something to him. That simple, unanswerable reason Pete had given. My wife died. No one within 3 days' ride. Same story. Thorne had been on this mountain for 11 years telling himself a story about solitude that was mostly true and partly not. The part that was true. He was better at living alone than most people were. He was suited to it by temperament. He'd built a life that worked without requiring anyone else to be part of it. And there was genuine satisfaction in that. The satisfaction of a thing built to last. The part that was not entirely true. That it was enough. That the 11 years of silence and competence and careful self-sufficiency had filled what had been emptied by the accident and the choice he'd made afterward. He'd been mistaken about enough. Not unhappy. He wasn't a man who did unhappy as a general condition. But not enough. Eleanor Voss, who had been left to die on a train platform and had spent 3 weeks in his cabin arguing with him and walking on a damaged foot and planning a clinic for people she hadn't met yet, with a calm certainty that things could be made better if you were willing to do the work. Eleanor Voss was not a convenient person to have in your life. She was not easy. She was not soft. She would not defer to him because he knew the mountain, and she didn't, would not allow him to manage her, would not let him be careless about what he said or how he said it, or whether his stated reasons matched his actual ones. She would, he thought, be the most inconvenient person he had ever known for the rest of his life. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to sleep. 3 days later, she asked him a direct question that had no comfortable answer. They were on the trail, not the uppercut, the main switchback, working through the lower section on snowshoes as part of her daily walking, which had extended now to well over a mile and back. The weather was good, cold but calm, the sky the hard, brilliant blue that came after a clear night. Their breath came in clean puffs. The snow creaked under the snowshoe frames. They'd been walking in comfortable quiet for most of it when she said, without preamble, "What happens when the trail is clear, in terms of—" A pause. "In terms of you?" He looked at her. "I mean, when I go down to the settlement," she said, "when the clinic is established and operating, what are you doing after that?" "Same thing I've been doing," he said, "trapping the upper runs, managing the cabin. Alone. That's generally how I do it." She walked several more steps. The snowshoes were loud. "I'm asking," she said carefully, "because I've been trying to figure out what you want out of—" She gestured vaguely in a way that was uncharacteristically imprecise for Eleanor. "This, whatever this is." He kept walking. The trail turned slightly north and the tree line opened up and the eastern ridge was visible across the valley, sharp and white against the blue sky. The assay building was over there somewhere, 4 miles by the main trail. He'd been there twice, years ago. He remembered the walls being solid. "What do you want?" he asked her. She looked at him. It was, he realized, the first time he'd turned the question back on her, and she hadn't expected it. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to build the clinic," she said. That's not in question. I've known that since the fever broke." Another pause. "But I've also been thinking about what Pete said, about his wife, about what it means to be the only person within range when something goes wrong." She looked at the ridge. "I don't want the clinic to be another thing that fails because I'm one person trying to do everything alone. You'd find people, train them. I need more than that." Her voice was steady and even and completely direct. "I need someone who knows the mountain, who can get to places I can't, who can handle the situations that aren't medical, the supply problems, the access problems, the—" She stopped. "Galt problems." He was quiet. "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to give up your life," she said. "I'm asking if you want a different version of it." She looked at him then, and he could see in her face all the things she was not saying alongside what she was saying, could see the careful management of what she'd allow to be visible. And underneath it, the things she wasn't managing because she didn't know how. "Because I think you might want a different version, and I think I might need one too, and I think those two things might not be a coincidence." The mountain was very quiet. The wind had stilled, and the only sound was the snow settling and the distant movement of something in the tree line. A bird, probably, shaking snow from a branch. He stopped walking. She stopped too, a half step ahead, and turned to look at him. "I've been alone for 11 years, he said. "I'm not—" He looked for the honest words. "I'm not easy to live alongside. I know that." "I'm not easy either," she said. "I know. That's not a comfort, Eleanor." Her mouth did the thing, the near smile, the involuntary one she was still mildly embarrassed by. "No, I suppose not." He looked at her. Standing there in the oversized wool coat on the mountain trail in snowshoes with her medical bag over one shoulder, because she took it everywhere by habit, and the cold making her cheeks red and her eyes very clear, looking back at him with the steady patience of a woman who had decided to say the difficult thing and was waiting to see what happened next. He thought about the 11 years. He thought about the accident. He thought about Pete Olander and the wife who died 60 miles north on a different mountain. He thought about Colin Barrett and his mother on the mule, and the thing Eleanor had said in the fever. He's 17 years old and his hand is crushed, and I am not walking away. He thought about the morning he'd found her on the depot platform, the 3 seconds of decision. I'm not promising anything easy, he said. I'm not asking for anything easy. There'll be problems. There will be significant problems, she said. Galt, for a start. The supply situation. The territory oversight. The building. She held his gaze. Do you want to help me solve them or not? The eastern ridge was there, white and solid, across the valley. 4 miles. Yes, he said. She nodded, once, like he'd confirmed something she'd been working out the math on for a while. No performance about it. No relief that spilled over into anything dramatic. Just Eleanor, receiving information and updating her plans accordingly. She turned back to the trail. We should look at the assay building before the next weather comes in, she said. If Pete's cousin can carry supplies, I want to have a list ready by the end of the month. I'll send word to Pete, he said, falling back into step. They walked the rest of the trail in the quiet that was their usual quiet. Inhabited, easy in its way, 2 people thinking about the same thing in their separate and compatible silences. The snowshoes were loud on the packed surface, and the cold was clean, and the mountain held them both the way it always held everything that moved across it, without preference, without warmth, without any interest in outcome. It was enough. The mountain didn't need to care. They were doing that themselves. When they came back to the cabin that afternoon, Thorne built the fire up, and Eleanor set her bag on the table and pulled out the notebook with the clinic plans, the pages dense with her small, precise handwriting. She opened it to a new page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, Assay Building, Inspection February. Below that, Olander Supply Route. Confirm. Then she wrote one more thing, which he saw when he passed behind her chair on the way to check the woodpile. Just 2 words, with a line under them. Not alone. He went to check the woodpile. The pile was fine. He stayed out in the lean-to with the dogs for a few extra minutes anyway, in the cold and the smell of dog and cured fur, until he felt like himself again, or whatever version of himself was still available on the other side of a conversation like the one they'd just had. Then he went back inside where the fire was burning and the plans were being made, and sat down at the table across from Eleanor Voss, and got to work. They went to the Eastern Settlement on the 14th of February, which was not a date either of them remarked on. The weather held. Cold but windless. The uppercut passable the way Thorne had said it would be in the right conditions. He went first, breaking trail on snowshoes, and she followed in his tracks, the staff in her right hand, the medical bag across her back. The exposed ridge section took 7 minutes to cross, and the wind came up slightly at the midpoint, enough that he stopped and looked back at her, and she looked back at him with an expression that said clearly she didn't need checking on. So he turned around and kept going. The assay building was in better condition than he'd expected and worse than she'd hoped, which put them approximately where he'd predicted they'd land. The walls were solid, fieldstone and timber, built to last because assay operations required precision, and precision required stable structures. The roof had failed in one corner, a section of roughly 10 square feet where the timber had rotted through and let the winter in. The floor was stone, cold but level. The windows were boarded and the interior smelled of old chemicals and rodents and long disuse. Eleanor walked through it twice without speaking. He watched her measure it with her eyes the way she measured most things, taking the true dimensions, not the apparent ones. The roof can be fixed, she said. Yes. The corner with the rot, how much of the support structure is compromised? I'd have to get up there to tell you properly. From what I can see, it's isolated. The main ridge beam looks sound. She was looking at the interior space, organizing it in her mind. He could almost see the layout forming, where the examination area would go, where supplies would be stored, where a person waiting for care could sit without being in the way. It's enough, she said. It's not what I designed from scratch, but it's enough. When do you want to start? She looked at him. As soon as you can get lumber up here. He could get lumber. He knew where it was and how to move it, and he had Pete Olander and Pete's cousin Abe and the supply route that Abe had agreed to, which solved the heaviest part of the logistics. He'd been solving the how of it in his head for 2 weeks, the same way he solved any practical problem. Methodically, from the outside in, identifying the hard constraints first and building around them. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3. 2, she said. He looked at her. Galt's been asking questions for a month, she said. The longer this takes, the more time he has to find a legal mechanism to complicate it. Halverson has money, and Halverson has lawyers, and I don't want to give either of them a running start. 2 weeks, he said. We'll see. It took 16 days, not because of any single problem, but because of the accumulation of problems that any real undertaking produces. The lumber delivery that ran 2 days late because of an unexpected ice storm on the lower trail. The roofing material that Abe Olander substituted without asking because the original order wasn't available, which required adjustment. The morning thorn fell through the weakened section of the assay building's floor that neither of them had identified because it had been hidden under accumulated debris, and came up with a gash along his forearm that Eleanor cleaned and stitched with a brisk efficiency that didn't quite conceal how her hands tightened when she saw the blood. It's not deep, he said. I can see that, she said, and continued stitching. You could take a breath. I'm breathing. You're doing the thing where you don't breathe. She tied off the last suture and looked up at him. You noticed that? I notice things, he said. Comes from spending time with someone who pays attention. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her bag, put the instruments away, and didn't say anything else about it. But the hands had stopped being tight. They weren't alone in the work. That surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. Eleanor had a quality he'd underestimated, which was that people wanted to help her. Not because she asked for help easily, but because when she was clear about what she was trying to do and why, it was difficult to find a reason not to be part of it. The Buford brothers came up from Frost Junction with tools and 3 days of work, charging nothing and explaining themselves with the same brevity Pete Olander had used. One of them had a sister who'd lost a child the previous winter with no medical care within reach. Another man, a former miner named Haskell, who'd settled in the eastern community after a back injury ended his work underground, showed up one morning and simply began working on the roof without asking anyone's permission. He had steady hands and no fear of heights, and he was worth 2 ordinary men on the repair. Colum Barrett came the second week. Thorne saw him before Eleanor did. A young man, 17 and looking younger, walking up the settlement track with his right hand wrapped in cloth and his left hand shoved in his coat pocket. He walked with the careful step of someone still managing pain, but he walked. He stopped at the building's entrance and looked in at the activity inside with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite making it. Eleanor came around from the back section where she'd been working and saw him. She stopped. Colum, she said. Miss Voss. His voice cracked slightly on it. He was looking at her with the particular intensity of a young person who has been through something that aged them and hasn't yet decided how to carry the age. Your hand, she said. It healed wrong, he said. The bones. Nobody knew how to set them right. I can use it, mostly. But it's... He stopped. I was told you were here, building something. I am. He looked around, at Thorne, at Haskell on the roof, at the Buford brothers fitting new window frames, at the building taking shape around the work. I want to help, he said. I can't do much with this hand yet, but I can do things. Eleanor looked at him for a moment with an expression that Thorne had never seen from her before. Not the controlled, managed version of her feelings, but the real thing, plain on her face for a second before she brought it back. Yes, she said. You can. Colum Barrett worked 3 days on the clinic, doing what he could one-handed, which turned out to be more than anyone had expected. On the last evening, Eleanor examined his hand properly, the first proper examination it had received since the injury. She told him what she found with the same honesty she gave everything, which meant she didn't soften it. The bones had set imperfectly and full function wouldn't return. But she also showed him, patiently and in detail, the exercises that would maximize what he had. She made him practice them in front of her, corrected his technique, and told him to come back in 2 weeks. Come back regardless, she said. Not because of the hand, just come back. He said he would. Thorne, watching from across the room, believed him. Galt came on a Wednesday, 3 days after the clinic opened. He arrived with 2 men Thorne didn't know, and one he did. A territory land agent named Birch, who had a reputation for finding creative readings of property boundaries when someone with money wanted a creative reading. They came up the settlement track on horseback, which told Thorne they'd ridden from Copper Ridge that morning and hadn't wanted to leave the horses below, which meant they'd expected trouble and wanted to be able to move fast. Eleanor was inside the clinic when they arrived. Thorne was outside, replacing a section of the exterior chinking that had come loose, and he saw them coming while they were still 50 yards out. He stepped down from the ladder he'd been on and stood in front of the clinic door without doing anything dramatic about it. Galt was a broad man in his 40s, with the kind of face that had probably been open once and had closed over the years into something that looked permanently skeptical of whatever it was looking at. He pulled his horse up and looked at the building and then at Thorne. "This is private property," Galt said. "It's not," Thorne said. "This building is on settlement land. Has been since the Halverson operation moved the assay work north 2 years ago. You can ask Birch about the deed status." Birch, who had been looking at the building with the calculating expression of a man doing arithmetic, shifted slightly on his horse and said nothing. "There's a question of what this structure is being used for," Galt said. "A medical operation requires territory certification, which Miss Voss holds." Thorne said it flatly. "Issued by the Territorial Medical Board in 1884, still current. If you'd like to see the paperwork, she'll be happy to show you." Galt looked at him. The 2 men he'd brought were watching Thorne with the professional attention of people who had been brought along in case watching turned into something else. Thorne was aware of this and was unbothered by it, which was the result of having spent enough years in hard country that the arithmetic of 2 against 1 had stopped being persuasive. "You're Maddox," Galt said. "I am. You've been helping her set this up." "Helping? Yes." He let it sit there. Galt looked at the building again. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when a man is running through options and not liking the available ones. The door of the clinic opened and Eleanor came out, wiping her hands on a cloth. She'd heard the horses. She looked at Galt with a recognition that was entirely cold. "Mr. Galt," she said. "Miss Voss." He didn't manage to make it sound like a greeting. "I understand you have questions about the certification of this clinic." She folded the cloth and put it in her coat pocket. "I've prepared documentation for exactly this kind of visit. The Territorial Board certification, the property deed status confirming the building sits outside the Halverson operations registered land, and a letter from the Territory's labor inspector confirming that independent medical operations serving mine worker settlements are both legal and encouraged under the 1882 worker welfare statutes." She looked at him evenly. "Would you like to come inside and review it?" Galt stared at her. "It's cold out here," she said. "You're welcome to come in." He didn't come in. He stayed on his horse and looked at the building and at Thorne and at Eleanor and at Birch, who had by now completed whatever arithmetic he was doing and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has decided he wants no further part of whatever this is. "This isn't finished," Galt said. "It is, actually," Eleanor said. "Or the legal part is. The medical part is just beginning." A pause. "If you have workers who need care, Mr. Galt, the clinic is open to them. That includes men from the mine. I don't exclude patients based on who employs them." Something moved through Galt's expression that was hard to identify. Not softening. Nothing that simple. More like the recognition of a position that has run out of obvious moves. He turned his horse and rode back down the settlement track. Birch and the 2 men followed without looking back. Thorne waited until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Eleanor. "You had that documentation ready," he said. "For 3 weeks," she said. "I wrote to the Territorial Board the day Pete Olander told us Galt was asking questions." She looked at the retreating horses. "He'll find a different approach. Galt isn't a man who gives up. He's a man who regroups." "I know, but it'll take him time, and while he takes time, the clinic runs." She turned back to the building. "That's the strategy. Not to defeat him, just to be more established than he can easily dismantle. That's not a permanent solution. No." She looked at him. "But it's enough for now, and now is what we have." He thought about that for a moment. She was right, the way she was usually right about the things she'd thought all the way through. You couldn't beat a man like Galt permanently. You could only outlast him, make yourself harder to remove than he had patience to manage, and wait for his attention to move on to something more easily solvable. It was unglamorous. It was also, on this frontier, what survival looked like. Galt sent a letter 2 weeks later through Birch, formal and full of legal language about property use ordinances that Thorne and Eleanor both read carefully and then took to a lawyer in the nearest town, a man named Creed, who charged a reasonable fee and found, without much difficulty, 3 separate reasons the letter's arguments didn't hold. He wrote a response. The response was sent. They didn't hear from Galt again that spring. That wasn't the end of it. Galt would make 2 more attempts over the following year, each one slightly less confident than the last. Each one meeting the same combination of Eleanor's documented preparation and Thorne's quietly immovable presence, and the growing fact that the Eastern settlements' families had come to depend on the clinic in ways that made removing it politically costly, even for someone with Halverson's money. The 3rd attempt failed so thoroughly that even Birch stopped returning Galt's correspondence, which Pete Olander reported with considerable satisfaction one evening over coffee. But that was later. In February and March, and into the first weeks of spring, it was just the work. Thorne had not expected to find satisfaction in what he was doing. He'd expected to find it tolerable, which was his usual measure for things outside his established competencies. But there was something in the particular combination of tasks: the physical work of maintaining and improving the building, the logistical management of supply lines and weather windows and access routes, the way the 2 parts of what he and Eleanor were doing fit together without overlap, that engaged him in a way he hadn't been engaged in years. He was useful in a way that had weight to it, not the self-contained usefulness of trapping, which was real but circular, always returning to itself. This was useful towards something that grew. He still ran his trap lines, still kept the cabin on the upper mountain, still managed the dogs and the pelt curing and the slow accumulated knowledge of the mountain that 11 years had built into his bones. But 4 days a week, sometimes 5, he was at the settlement, moving supplies, fixing what broke, making the trail between the cabin and the clinic something that could be managed in all but the worst conditions, building, slowly and without fanfare, a network of routes and contacts and arrangements that meant Eleanor was never as isolated as she might have been. He did not think of it in romantic terms. He thought of it in practical ones, because that was how he thought, and because the practical terms were true enough. She needed what he could provide. He had, unexpectedly, found that providing it was not the sacrifice he might once have predicted. Eleanor opened the clinic on a Monday morning in early March to 3 patients, a minor with an infected hand, a child with a fever of concerning height, and Haskell, the former miner, who came in claiming a sore shoulder but who Eleanor suspected had come mainly to see that the place was running. She treated all 3. The miner's infection responded to treatment. The child's fever broke by evening. Haskell's shoulder was, as she'd suspected, mostly fine. Colum Barrett came back, as he'd said he would, and kept coming back. He had a quick mind and careful hands, the left one, the undamaged one, and Eleanor began quietly to teach him. Not formal instruction, just the accumulated small education of being in a room with someone who knew things and paying attention. He learned how to clean and dress a wound properly. He learned what signs in a fever required urgent action and which could be managed with patience and time. He learned, slowly, the difference between the human body's resilience and its limits, which was the fundamental thing that all medical knowledge reduced to in the end. By summer, he was more help than not. By autumn, he was indispensable. The mountain changed in spring the way it always did, dramatically, and without asking anyone's opinion about the timing. The snow pulled back from the lower trails first, then from the switchbacks, then from everything except the highest runs, which kept their white until June and sometimes later. The creek below the north tree line ran loud with snowmelt. The dogs, freed from the cabin's proximity, ranged farther on the lines and came back with mud on them, and the energized look of animals who had spent 3 months being patient. Thorne found himself, one morning in April, standing at the top of the upper cut and looking east toward Copper Ridge. The settlement was visible from there on clear days, Chaffin. Not the individual buildings, just the suggestion of smoke and permanence, the signs of people living in one place over time. He could see the assay building, the clinic, if he knew where to look, which he did. He stood there for a while. The wind was light and came from the south, which meant warmth and the smell of things beginning to grow again. The particular green smell of snow melt and earth that was, on Iron Peak, the smell of the world remembering itself. He thought about the depot platform, the 3 seconds, the medical bag in her frozen hands. He thought about a man he'd loved like a brother, whose name he still didn't say out loud, who had died in bad terrain in a bad winter when decisions had been made in the wrong order. He'd carried that for 11 years as a reason to stay small and stay alone and stop being the kind of person who made decisions that affected other people. He'd thought of it as wisdom. He'd thought of it as appropriate punishment. He hadn't understood until Eleanor that it was also fear wearing the clothes of wisdom. Fear of what it would cost him if he lost someone again, dressed up in the language of responsibility and paid for in solitude. He still thought about his friend. He still carried the weight of it. He suspected he always would, and he'd made a kind of peace with that. The peace that comes not from resolution, but from learning to move with something instead of being stopped by it. He turned away from the ridge and went back down the trail. Eleanor was at the clinic when he arrived, which was where she usually was by mid-morning. She was with a patient, a woman from the settlement's northern edge who had been coming in for 3 weeks with a persistent respiratory illness that Eleanor was managing carefully and seriously. He waited outside until the woman left, then went in. Eleanor was writing in the patient log. She'd started keeping meticulous records from the first week, a habit that irritated Galt's lawyers because it meant her medical decisions were documented and defensible, and her patient outcomes were demonstrably better than the absence of care would have produced. He suspected she'd have kept the records regardless. "Woman from the North End," he said. "Mrs. Avery, she's improving." Eleanor didn't look up from the log. Slowly, "You were worried about her last week." "I'm still worried about her. Less than last week." She finished the entry, closed the log. Then she looked up. "You went to the uppercut this morning." He hadn't told her this. He looked at her. "You take a longer loop on the trap line when you're thinking about something," she said. "The uppercut is where you go when you want to see far." He sat down in the chair that had appeared 3 weeks ago in the clinic's front room, installed by Colum without explanation and accepted by everyone without comment. He looked at Eleanor across the room, at the medical bag on its dedicated shelf, the patient log, the wall where she'd pinned a hand-drawn anatomy diagram that she used when explaining injuries to patients who'd never had anything explained to them by a medical person before, at the woman who had been left on a depot platform in a blizzard and had turned that into this. "I was thinking about my friend," he said, "the one who died." She was quiet, giving him the space. "I think I've been—" He stopped, found the honest word, "using it as a reason to not be in anything that mattered, because if you're not in it, it can't be taken." Eleanor looked at him. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance, which was one of the things he most valued about her. "That's a reasonable thing to do," she said, "when you've been hurt that way." "It's a coward's thing." "It's a human thing," she said, "and you stopped doing it." "Debatable when I stopped." "December 14th, she said, "when you loaded an unconscious stranger onto your sled in a blizzard." She held his gaze. "That's when you stopped." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the settlement was going about its day. He could hear the normal sounds of it, children somewhere, the distant ring of metalwork, a horse, the ordinary ongoing noise of people living close enough together to hear each other. "I'm not going back to the way it was," he said. He meant it as a statement. It came out sounding like something he was telling himself as much as her. "No," she said simply. "Neither am I." He nodded. She went back to the patient log, opening it to a new page. He got up and went to look at the roof section that had been repaired in February, checking what the winter's end had done to the new timbers. They were holding. He'd known they would. Haskell had done good work, but he checked anyway, because checking was what you did. Later that evening, walking the trail back to the cabin, Eleanor beside him at the pace they'd settled into over months of walking this route together, he thought about what she'd said. December 14th. Maybe she was right. Maybe the 3 seconds on the depot platform had been the moment the 11 years ended. Not because of anything complicated, but because a person in front of you who needs help is the simplest argument in the world against staying small. The mountain was turning green at its lower edges. The creek was still loud with melt. The dogs would be waiting at the cabin, ready for supper, uninterested in anything that had happened to him that didn't involve food. "Colum asked me today," Eleanor said after they'd been walking a while, "if there was a way to get more formal training, whether there were programs in the territory." "What did you tell him?" "That there were, and that I'd write letters on his behalf, and that he'd need to go south for at least a year to do it properly." She paused. "He said he'd think about it, but he looked at the clinic when he said it. He doesn't want to leave." "He'll figure it out," Thorne said. "People do." "They do," she agreed. They walked the rest of the way in the good quiet that had become the sound of their life together. Not silent, exactly, but at ease with whatever space existed between words. The kind of quiet you only develop with a person you've been through something real with, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. The cabin was lit from inside. He'd built the fire before they left, and it had held. The dogs came up the path to meet them, Brick first as always, Soot close behind, the brindle female, still without a name, still answering to her, circling both of them with the undignified enthusiasm that she reserved for returns, as if each arrival was a thing worth celebrating regardless of how long they'd been gone. Eleanor crouched and let the brindle push her nose into her hands, which she always did. She'd never been a dog person before the mountain, she told him once. She'd said it with the mild wonder of someone discovering an unexpected thing about themselves. "You should name her," Eleanor said. "I've been meaning to. For 11 years. He looked at the brindle dog, who looked back at him with the uncomplicated loyalty of a creature that had never needed him to be anything other than what he was. He thought about it. "November," he said. Eleanor looked up at him. "That's when I got her," he said. "November, 4 years ago, off a trapper who was moving on." Eleanor considered this. "That's not a very imaginative name." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She scratched the dog behind the ears. November accepted this as her due and pressed into it. Eleanor looked up at Thorne with the expression he knew best now, the one that was almost a smile and didn't need to become one to mean what it meant. "It suits her anyway," Eleanor said. He opened the cabin door. The fire was warm inside, the smell of it the same smell it had always been. Wood smoke, old wool, the accumulated particular scent of a place lived in by someone who stayed. He'd always thought of it as his smell, the smell of his solitude. It had changed in the months since Eleanor, and he'd noticed the change and had not tried to put it back. She came in behind him and set the medical bag on its shelf. She'd given it a shelf in the cabin, too, weeks ago, without asking, and sat down at the table with the patient log she'd been carrying, opening it to continue the entry she'd started at the clinic. He put another log on the fire. Outside, Iron Peak held the last of the evening light on its highest points, the snow up there going pink and then gray, and then the deep blue of early dark. Somewhere across the valley, the eastern settlement's lights were coming on, one by one. The clinic would be dark and locked, but it would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the patients who came to it would be received by someone who didn't give up on them for being inconvenient or expensive or difficult, and treated with the plain, serious competence that Eleanor brought to everything she did. Thorne had spent 11 years becoming the kind of man who needed no one, and answered to nothing but the mountain. He'd thought that was strength. He understood now that it was only part of strength, the lonelier part, the part that keeps you alive but doesn't tell you why. The rest of it was this: the fire going in the hearth, the woman at the table building something worth building, the dog with the plain, honest name pressing against his leg, and the mountain outside the window that had always been waiting, without preference, for him to figure out the difference. He sat down across from Eleanor. She didn't look up from the log. "Supper," she said. A statement, not quite a question. "I'll start it," he said. He did. The cabin was warm. The work continued, and on Iron Peak, in the deep and patient dark of a frontier that had never promised anyone anything, 2 stubborn and imperfect people stayed. That was enough. That was everything.